Who started the 67 war?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, Brian, that this is a war that very few people wanted, and nobody anticipated.
Who's prime minister?
Prime Minister is Levi Eshkol.
Who is the defense minister?
Defense Minister is Levi Eshkol as well, up till a few days before the war when Moshe Dayan is brought in as the defense minister.
And what had he been doing?
He had been in an opposition party to the government with Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion had broken away from the Labor Party to form his own party, and had been a very vituperative, acerbic critic of the Israeli government of Levi Eshkol.
Was it a coalition government?
It was a coalition government, but not with Ben-Gurion in it.
Who was the chief of staff of the military?
Chief of staff of the military was Yitzhak Rabin. There was some very prodigious personalities in this government. There was the National Religious Party, which today is, by the way, is a pretty outspoken right-wing party. Then it was an outspoken left-wing party. There was the Achdut Avodah, which was a kibbutz party that was in many ways so far left-wing it came around and was right-wing. Sort of labor hawks.
So let's go around the horn quickly. Who ran Jordan?
King Hussein.
Who ran Syria?
There was a triumvirate of what they call the doctors' government, because they all had doctors in psychology or philosophy. But there was a Ba'athist regime, a radical Marxist regime that had a front of a civilian government, but behind it was a military junta, in which the principal figure was Hafiz al-Assad.
And his son now is in control.
Right.
And the King Hussein's son is now in control.
Right.
Who ran Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia was run by the Saudi family. There was King Saud.
Did they get involved in the
Saud.
67 war at all, the Saudis?
They sent a force to the border saying that they were going to join the war, and then they didn't join the war.
Who ran Iraq?
Secretly, they were telling the Americans, we hope the Israelis get rid of Nasser.
Who ran Iraq?
Iraq was also run by a Ba'athist regime. There was a President Arif, who is no more. A radical. The Arab world was divided between conservatives and radicals. The conservatives being the monarchies, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf states, and the radicals being Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and Algeria.
Arafat?
Arafat was running an organization called Al-Fatah, which remains his basic organization today.
Living where?
He was operating out of Damascus at the time, and he was conducting terrorist operations against Israel with the specific objective, the long-term objective, of creating instability in the Middle East and dragging the whole area into war. It's not by accident. I opened this book, a discussion of the 67 war, with Al-Fatah's first terrorist operation against Israel on New Year's Eve 1965. It was an abortive operation, and then I show how a series of these attacks led to an escalation of tensions in the Middle East and eventually succeeded in plunging the region into war far beyond the expectations of even the Syrians who were promoting these operations.
Now, you mentioned Nasser earlier. Where was Sadat?
Sadat was an underling of Nasser. He was the spokesman of the National Assembly, a person not highly regarded in Egypt, though he did have a key role in the outbreak of the Six-Day War. On May 11th and May 12th, Sadat had been sent on a state visit to North Korea. Remember, Egypt this time is a radical state. They have connections with North Korea. On the way back from North Korea, Sadat pays a courtesy call to Moscow. And there he is told by Soviet leaders that the Soviet Union has learned of an impending Israeli invasion of Syria.
Who's running the Soviet Union?
So the Soviet Union is also run by a triumvirate. This is a day of troikas. There was Podgorny, Brezhnev, and Kosygin. And there were tremendous divisions between them, but in the Brezhnev camp there was an interest in lessening pressures on North Vietnam, which at that time was being bombed by the United States, by fomenting a crisis in the Middle East.
So as Sadat lands in Moscow in May of 1967, what is the readiness of the Israeli army at that point and the Air Force?
Not very ready.
I mean, you would have been at your desk at the Shalem
No,
Center.
but the reserves haven't been called up. There was general tension in the area, particularly with the Syrians. The Syrians have been firing on border settlements in northern Galilee. the Syrians had been attempting to divert the Jordan River before it reached Israel and to really dry up the Jewish state by diverting this river. And Israel had responded to this project by bombing the Syrian earthwork projects.
Who controlled the Sea of Galilee at that time?
Israel.
So it was
Israel,
not
but the Syrians were only 10 meters off on one part of the eastern shore. And it was not uncommon for Israeli fishing boats to be shot at or shelled. There were a number of instances. There was constant tension on the northern border, but the estimate of Israeli intelligence, which has such a high reputation, was that war in the Middle East would not break out for at least another 3 years. And nobody foresaw the war.
And it ended up breaking out June 5th, right after the May visit of Sadat.
Right. So Sadat lands in Moscow. The Soviets tell him that there's this plan by the Israelis to invade Syria, to capture Damascus, the Syrian capital. Sadat goes back and tells this to Nasser. Nasser sends his chief of staff, Fauzi, to Damascus to see if there's any evidence of this. The Soviets had told Sadat of between 13 and 15 Israeli brigades massing on the northern border. So Fauzi lands in Damascus.
Northern border of
Israel, on the southern border of Syria. And Fauzi goes to Damascus and very quickly ascertains from the Syrians that the Syrians know nothing of this. The Syrians aren't on alert. He actually takes a small plane up to look at the border, doesn't see any Israeli forces massing there, and he reports this to Nasser. Nasser decides, for political reasons, to ignore the advice of his chief of staff and to act as if the Soviet warning is true, that Israel indeed intended to invade Syria, and he sends his entire army into Sinai. He sends 100,000 men into Sinai, 1,000 tanks.
And the Sinai is about how far from Jerusalem? You got in the car and drove.
If you got in the car and drove, it would be about 5 hours.
And if you got all the way to the end?
No, well, the closest point is about 2.5 hours. Take it back.
And how long does it take you to drive across the Sinai?
Sinai is quite large. That's about 4 or 5 hours from tip to tip.
So yeah, Mr. Nasser sends the troops up to the border of the Sinai?
So along the Israeli border.
Along the Israeli border.
Now the question is...
Sinai is controlled by the Egyptians.
Right. But at the end of the 1956 war, as in return for Israel's withdrawal from Sinai was also taken by the Israelis in 56, the United Nations put in a UN peacekeeping force into Sinai. United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF.
How many men?
At that time, about 15,000. And Nasser, when he begins to send forces into Sinai, informs UNEF that they're going to have to leave.
Well, how can he do that?
Because Egypt's rights vis-a-vis UNEF were very ambiguous. Dag Hammarskjöld, who was really the architect of UNEF in 1957, early 1957, described the arrangement as the good faith agreement. That is, essentially, the UNEF was situated on sovereign Egyptian territory. It was there at the discretion of Egypt. That once Egypt decided to oust UNEF, it certainly had a sovereign right to do that. But before it did that, it was understood that Egypt would first inform the General Assembly, that there would be a General Assembly discussion about whether UNEF had fulfilled its historic mission. Now, Nasser ignored that part of the good faith agreement and simply informed the UNEF that they had to leave. Now, the Secretary General of the UN was Utant at the time, and rather than raising a protest to Nasser's precipitative move, he immediately acquiesced and ordered UNEF to remove itself.
You imply that Utant, was he a Burmese? Who was head of the UN, or Secretary General, was a weak character?
I don't think he was the strongest character in the world. I think that was the understanding of the United States as well.
Had Dag Hammarskjöld been a strong character?
He had been a much stronger character, very dominant character.
So you have, and what kind of let me jump off track just a second here, because you got some interesting personal stuff. You say, you talk a lot about Nasser and his chief of staff. That at one point in this whole thing that they contemplate suicide, or at least Amir contemplates suicide.
The relationship between Amir is the de facto head of the Egyptian army, Abdul Hakim Amir. Nasser is the president of Egypt. He is by any other terms, he's a military dictator. He came to power in a military coup, and he has been the unchallenged leader of Egypt since the Egyptian Revolution in the early 1950s. But Amir begins to acquire power, beginning in the late 1950s, early 1960s. He becomes the commander of the army, and the army is the base of power for this military regime. He acquires all sorts of other titles. By the 1960s, he's also the head of the Egyptian Soccer Federation. He acquires considerable wealth and influence. And Amr and Nasser have this extraordinarily complex and convoluted relationship. On one hand, Amr poses the greatest threat to Nasser's rule. He is Nasser's most bitter political rival. On the other hand, Nasser and Amr are best friends. They live next door to one another. They go on vacations together. Their families marry with one another. They have nicknames for each other, and they love each other. So you have this strange mixture of fear and affection, and it greatly confuses Egyptian decision making. I'll give you just one example about the question of UNEF. We talked about the UN forces before. Nasser wanted the UNEF to pull back from the border and to remain in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now, Sharm el-Sheikh is an area of the Sinai Peninsula that overlooks the Straits of Tiran at the entrance to the Red Sea. Those straits had been blockaded to Israeli shipping. If you look on a map, Brian, you'll see that the Red Sea leads up to Israel's southern port of Eilat. And from Eilat, Israel could reach the ports of Asia and Africa. And once you sealed off those straits, the straits were only about 1.5 miles wide, Israel was effectively blockaded from the sea, and that was an act of war under international law as well. It's a casus belli, a reason for going to war. Nasser did not want the UN forces to be removed from Sharm el-Sheikh because he knew that once they were removed from Sharm el-Sheikh, he, as an Egyptian, would not be able to sit there and watch Israeli boats pass by. He would have to blockade those straits again, and that could cause a war. So he sent instructions to his officers, who were to meet with the heads of UNEF, telling them, we want you to move back from the border, but we want you to stay in Sharm el-Sheikh. We also want you to stay in Gaza. Amr changed the orders. He changed the orders for personal reasons. He actually was interested in precipitating war with Israel so he could regain some glory that he had lost in the 56 war. He changed the orders. And we know this for a fact now. We actually have the protocol of the meeting. That the Egyptians who came to the UN forces in Sinai said, we need you to pull out entirely from Sharm el-Sheikh, from Gaza. And at the same time, Amr sent Egyptian paratroopers to occupy Sharm el-Sheikh. Once he did that...
Where did you find this information?
We found this information in the UN archives. UN archives also operate according to the 30-year rule. They're in terrible disarray. There are thousands upon thousands of documents in stacks on the floor.
Where?
At the UN archive on 29th Street.
In New York City?
In New York City. And you sit there and you sift through these, and you eventually come up to reports from the field. I received them from Egyptian sources, from memoirs of the officers involved, from Egyptian documents that existed in one particular archive in Cairo, the Dar al-Khayyam archive. And a very interesting source for me was, I also rely heavily on oral histories. And which I did in most cases. I didn't go to Syria, I'll tell you.
It's the only place you didn't go?
Yeah.
You went to Jordan, went to Egypt,
yeah.
Did you go to Saudi Arabia?
No, but there were no interviews from Saudi Arabia.
Iraq?
No. Only the three countries that were in which interviews took place in the Arab world are Syria, Jordan, and Egypt.
And you didn't go to Syria?
No, I had an assistant go to Syria. It's a little problematic. I could as an American citizen, but...
Because you're a Jew, or your assistant a Jew also that went to Syria?
No, but not because I'm a Jew, because I'm an Israeli.
Any Israelis go to Syria?
There have been Israelis go to Syria on foreign passports, but it's risky. Why risk it? And I have an excellent assistant.
How many oral histories did you capture?
And there's a long list there. I think there's maybe
100?
There's close to 100 maybe.
And over what period of time?
In the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, over 3 years. The former Soviet Union, in the United States, in France.
Over how many years did you do this?
3 years. It was a 3-year project.
And you finished this book when?
The beginning of this year. I finished this book just around September 11th.
Of 2001?
Of 2001.
Okay.